Grunt on Cybertron, Chapter 4. Iacon, capital of Cybertron, once the largest and greatest city in the Cybertronian Empire, the greatest city in the known galaxy. Now it's rubble. Grunt was slowly approaching it in vehicle form, a repulsor truck. He'd been a repulsor truck since he had been brought online a few centuries ago. He'd never changed his alt form. He could have, especially before the war, but it was never an urgent thing. And besides, if he changed his alt form, he would have to learn how to drive a different kind of vehicle. Some Transformers loved learning new alt forms and racing. Ugh, they loved racing. Grunt hated racing. He was awful at it. He liked fighting. Not for killing, but for fun. Hand-to-hand competition. Boxing, wrestling, martial arts. Grunt had spent decades among the fleshlings of the Empire, and they had loved these sports. He had grown to love them too, and he was good at it. So he had focused on it, building his already considerable strength, taking it to higher and higher levels as he learned different fighting styles and studied under the great masters across the Empire. Grunt had spent decades in his humanoid robot form, never needing to turn back into his repulsor truck form. But that was before the war. Then came the war. Grunt had joined the Autobot army to defend the Empire against the Decepticon rebels. He hadn't seen a lot of action, mostly guard duty, and later search and rescue work after Doc joined the team, and now the war was all but over, and there was nothing left. The space bridge network went first. Then Cybertron fought itself to its own destruction. They fought until the Energon reserves were all but gone. Now there were barely any buildings left standing on Cybertron and almost no Cybertronians left. And still they fight on. Iacon, the city Grunt came online in, the apple of Cybertron, the greatest city in the galaxy, and Grunt was here on a scavenging mission. Forager had already flown over the desolation of the once great city. He had told Grunt what to look for, and more importantly, where. Their tiny crew, probably the largest group of Autobots left on Cybertron, had found an almost working shuttle. With the right resources, Doc was sure he could get it flying again. He already had the hyperdrive working. But then, Doc could fix anything. So it was up to good old Grunt to get the scrap they needed. Good old, super strong, dumb as a brick, Grunt. Grunt sighed. Everyone had to do their part. Secundus led, Forager scouted, Doc fixed, Grinder shot, Grunt carried. Oh, and sometimes he got to punch Decepticreeps. To be fair, they had been a search and rescue unit, not a combat unit. And truth be told, Grunt had gotten to pull a lot of damaged Autobots out of bad situations. That felt good. Now most of those bots were online in deep storage, sitting on a shelf in a protected warehouse, just a processor and a spark chamber and a tiny metal box waiting for the war to end so that they can be inserted in a new protoform body and brought back online. Grunt sighed. Life was hardly fair, and he certainly wouldn't have chosen himself to be one of the last Transformers in the universe still online. But here he was, following Secundus' orders. If they could get the shuttle running, if they could get off Cybertron, if they could get to a safe world, then they could wait for the Decepticons to run out of Energon, and maybe in a few decades or a century or so, they could come back to Cybertron and rebuild. Doc was sure of it, and Doc was mostly right. He was a lot smarter than Grunt. Doc knew all sorts of things. Secundus trusted Doc to be right. Secundus trusted Grunt to pick things up and put them down. Grunt sighed. He had come to the edge of the ruins and slowed down. He was much faster as a repulsor truck than he was as a robot, which was why he traveled to Iacon as a truck. But now he had more than rough terrain to navigate. Megatron's Viacons had bombed this city into scrap, the so-called Seekers. What a bunch of scrap. Grunt transformed and scanned the skies. He didn't have a fancy radar or macro-optical enhancers. His tools were more practical. So Grunt relied on his eyes. Not all Decepticons were fighter jets, but most of them were. Well, most of the ones that were left. Scanning the sky was always a good idea. After a couple minutes of scanning, Grunt didn't see any signs of any cons, so he sighed and started his hike. He walked through the city, sliding down piles of rubble, walking for a while and then climbing up a series of jagged metal building frame pieces. Forager had seen a large piece of what looked like quadranium alloy beams that was probably part of the old Mirage Consortium headquarters, if even one of those beams was still intact, and if Grunt could get it back to headquarters, and if... Grunt sighed and kept hiking. He would get there when he got there. If there was even anything there. No, that wasn't fair to Forager. Forager was an explorer before the war. He was one amazing scout. If he said that there was quadranium there, well, there would definitely be something there. Grunt was lost in thought when he fell. He didn't trip. The ground gave out from underneath him. That was a problem with walking through ruins. Stable ground was never a guarantee. It was a long drop. Grunt almost landed on his feet. Almost. Of course, Grunt was built like a brick of electrum. He was fine. From what little Grunt could see, the ground was pretty messed up through it, though. How much of it was from the fall and how much was from the Decepticons' bombing all those years ago, that was up for debate. There was little sunlight in the hole Grunt found himself in. It took him a moment to remember that he had headlights. He turned them on with a thought and found himself staring down the barrel of a laser gun. Grunt looked up. The laser gun was a part of a robot's arm, an integrated weapon. Grunt looked for a symbol, Decepticon or Autobot. He didn't see either. Grunt's Autobot symbol was clearly on display on his chest. Don't move, the robot said, his laser shaking slightly. Grunt nodded. That laser wasn't a threat to him. His body wasn't made of electrum, but he was a lot tougher than he looked, and he looked tough. Civilian? Are there any civilians left anymore? The unknown robot asked. He pointed his hand laser gun more firmly at Grunt, an intense look overcoming his face. What are you doing here? Cybertron. I'm an Autobot. I'm no threat to you. Sure, no threat at all. An Iacon is in perfect shape thanks to you Autobots. Grunt shrugged, putting his hands by his side. I didn't blow it up. I was brought online in the Iacon. Everyone was brought online here. It used to be the Allspark's most common stop. Get your hands back up. Grunt sighed and brought his hands up. I'm not going to hurt you. Show me how to get back to the surface, and I'll be out of your hair. Sure, and then Decepticons trailing you attack, and I go up as collateral damage. Or worse, you find my Energon stock and offline me for it. I don't think so. Grunt shook his head. I've got a solar port. I don't need your Energon. I just want to get back to the surface as quickly as possible. The unknown robot's face lit up. Solar ports converted light into Energon. A bot with a solar port would never run out of Energon, theoretically. Sure, and I'll lead you to the surface. For that solar port. Grunt scowled at the unknown robot's predatory offer. He lowered his hands. No thanks. I'll find the surface on my own. The unknown robot took a step forward and shoved the laser gun hand in Grunt's face. Maybe I'll just offline you and take the solar port. In a flash, Grunt reached out, grabbing the laser gun and crushing it in a single, simple move. The unknown robot screamed and dropped to his knees in pain. Grunt reached the same hand down, wrapped his hand around the unknown robot's neck, and casually lifted him up until the robot's feet were dangling. You're going to leave me out of here. No tricks. And I'm going to do my best to forget you threatened me with that broken blaster. My hand! That was my hand! Grunt squeezed the unknown robot's neck until he felt the metal grind against his hand. That's right. Was. The unknown robot gasped for a bit. Grunt waited for him to stop struggling before he loosened his grips. Transformers didn't need to breathe unless they wanted to talk. The unknown robot could transmit over an open AM radio frequency. He didn't need vocal cords to communicate. He was probably in too much pain to think of that, though. The robot inhaled greedily. I'll show you the way out. Grunt released him, and the robot dropped to the floor in a pile. Get up. The robot managed to get up to his knees, cradling his broken hand. I'm sorry. You certainly are. Now start walking. The robot turned slowly, keeping a fearful eye on Grunt. I'll give you some of my energon if you let me live. I don't want your energon. Doc probably could find a good use for it, but Grunt wasn't a thief. Besides, this pathetic bot would need it to heal up his hand, and just to survive. I want to get back to the surface, and I don't want to climb my way out. Maybe he should just climb. Grunt was a great climber. But no, this pile of ruins was unstable. The unknown robot nodded eagerly. Oh yeah, sure. I can get you out of here, Mr. Autobot, sir. Grunt sighed. He didn't really want this reaction either. This was still better than having a gun in his face. He followed the robot out. It wasn't a long walk, mostly inclines and a few ladders that Grunt wasn't entirely sure would support his weight. Soon enough they were back on the surface. The unknown robot wouldn't leave his warrens. Goodbye, Autobot. Grunt shook his head. If you're smart, you'll take some of that energon stack, find a working space bridge, and get off-world. Most of the space bridges were functional. They just didn't have enough energon to run full time without the Allspark. Grunt didn't know how much energon it would take to run one for the minute or two a single bot would need to get off-world. Probably a lot if smart bots like Doc and Secundus didn't think it was a smart idea. Or maybe there was another reason. Grunt didn't know. But Cybertron wasn't a safe place for civilians anymore. It wasn't really safe for anyone. I'm not leaving Cybertron. You fools have almost finished killing each other. Grunt sighed. Well, you've lived this long. Good luck. The unknown robot blinked. I thought you were going to offline me. I almost did. You certainly asked me to. The civilian had started that fight by pointing his blaster at Grunt, and the Autobot could have offlined him easily enough. With a sigh, Grunt started walking away. I've offlined enough bots already. Taking a sip. The rest of the walk to the former Mirage Consortium building was uneventful. Forager was right. A long quadranium girder was sticking out from the rubble, perpendicular to the ground. There had been a number of earthquakes over the last few months. A lot of rubble had shifted. That's how Secundus stumbled over the hyperspace shuttle Doc was so sure he could get running again. If Grunt could get enough scrap. If Grunt was smarter, he'd know what would happen he'd know what would happen if he shifted the rubble by ripping the girder out of the ground. It wasn't the first time Grunt wished he was smarter. It wasn't the first time Grunt wished he was smarter that day. At least the lessons of a hard-knock life taught him to be wary of just ripping the girder out of the ground. He climbed the mound the girder was standing out from, and got in close to see what the situation was. Standing almost 100 feet in the air, there could be hundreds more under the rubble. Maybe a bend in it, maybe two. Well, staring at it wasn't going to move it at all. Grunt started moving rubble away from the girder. It didn't take him long to get down a few dozen feet, clearing a circle around the girder. A normal bot would be able to move the girder, let alone rip it out. Wouldn't be able to move the girder, let alone rip it out of the ground. A smarter bot would cut the girder where it was and drag that back to base. Too bad Grunt didn't have any sort of cutting tool. Parachute, inner tube, electrical grounding, and 3 solar ports, all from his days as a long hauler. Grunt wasn't a mechanic, wasn't much of anything else. Unless you needed someone beaten up, or something moved. Grunt was a lot stronger than he looked. And he looked strong. Grunt was out of ideas. He stepped up to the girder. It was thicker than he was, taller by quite a lot too. That didn't really matter. He spread his arms out, lowering his hips a bit, grabbing the girder as best he could, and lifted with his legs. The girder shifted quite a bit, lifting with Grunt when the rubble under his feet gave out. Grunt fell to the ground as the girder shifted, rumbled, and shifted again. It started to wobble as Grunt scrambled to his feet and backed away. It waved back and forth a few times, and then started to fall. Grunt backed up more, staying out of the way of the obvious landing areas. It waved back and forth a few more times before it wobbled past the point of no return and crashed to the ground, throwing rubble up in the air. The impact on the ground sent Grunt flying up into the air. He landed hard, but again, the ground got the worst of it. Normally, it would take a half dozen or so Class II Cybertronians to move a girder this large. or a couple Class 3s, or if he had access to a Gestalt, one Class 4. Once he was back on his feet, Grunt walked up to the girder, and without hesitation, he lifted one end of the girder, walked himself to the middle of it, and laid it on his shoulder. It was a long walk back to the headquarters Secundus and Doc had set up, and he couldn't use his alt form now. Grunt sighed. He was burning daylight. Grunt started walking. He called up Forager on the AM radio and gave him an update. Grunt didn't have any fancy comm tools. You could always call Forager. He was usually in the air, scouting and whatnot. Forager would pass it along. Doc and Secundus would be working on the shuttle, so they wouldn't be able to receive an AM comm. Grinder would be standing guard, somewhere out of sight. If he needed help, they'd probably all come running, but he was Grunt. He picked things up and put them down. He wasn't a great soldier. That was Grinder. He wasn't smart. Doc was smart. He wasn't fast. Forager was fast. And he could fly. Forager might be the last Autobot online that could fly. He wasn't a leader. That was Secundus. Grunt picked things up and put them down. None of the others could pick up his girder, let alone walk it back to base. Grunt sighed. He wasn't burning daylight, but he sure wasn't going to make good time. It'd probably take 3 days to make it back to base. If there was one thing he had, it was time. The old plan had been to wait out the Decepticons. There weren't many more Decepticons left on Cybertron. Maybe 10 or 15 Decepticons for each of the Autobots and Secundus' crew. Unicron, take Megatron and his thrice-rusted Viacons. Viacons were young and not that bright, but there were a lot of them, and their blasters were just as deadly as any Autobot blaster. Grunt hadn't seen a named Decepticon in half a century. Just Viacons. But the Decepticons were running out of energon, and every single member of Secundus' crew had at least one solar port. And with Doc there to patch them back up, they could outlast the Decepticreeps. It was just a matter of time. A waiting game. Probably decades. Decades weren't that long to wait. Not for Cybertronians. The new plan was to get the shuttle running and get off of Cybertron, and this quadranium girder would do a great deal to patching up the hull. They didn't need a perfect hull. Cybertronians could withstand the vacuum of space and even hyperspace travel, but atmospheric exit and re-entry could do some damage. He'd been walking for more than 2 days when he saw the jet in the sky. At first, Grunt thought it was Forager, so he waved. He was ashamed at how long it took him to realize Forager would not only have spotted him on radar first, but also that Forager would have contacted him on the AM radio frequency. So it wasn't Forager. It was probably a Decepticon. When he saw the Decepticon symbols on the wings, Grunt dropped the girder, and in 2 not-so-smooth motions, he pulled his ion pistol out of his payload and aimed it at the Decepticon. The Viacon changed course, veering away from Grunt. Grunt took a few pot shots, and Grunt wasn't a bad shot, but at that range he wasn't going to connect. Scrap. Grunt sighed. The Viacon would be back. Probably with his friends. Scrap. Grunt walked to the front of the girder, lifted it up, then walked himself to the middle of the girder and laid it back on his shoulder. He was burning daylight. It was over an hour later that he remembered he should AM comm Forager and let him know what had happened. It was a while later before he got over his embarrassment and actually calmed him. Grunt knew he wasn't smart. Not like Doc. Not even like Grinder. He was trying to get smarter, but it was hard. Harder than getting stronger. He was about as strong as any Autobot had ever been. But he was still getting stronger faster than he was getting smarter. Grunt was okay with who he was, more or less, and he was young. He had millennia ahead of him to get smart like Doc, or even Grinder. But he didn't like reminding everyone that he wasn't smart. He knew they knew. He just... Grunt sighed. He was burning daylight. It was 3 hours more before the Decepticons came back. 3 jets, exactly the same in vehicle form, except for the color of their paint. Grunt sighed. He was on open ground. There was no cover. He dropped the girder again and brought his ion pistol to bear as the jets bore down on him. He started walking, trying to get the girder between him and the jets. He didn't need a stray shot damaging his salvage. With enough distance, they'd shoot over the girder and just hit Grunt, and Grunt could take a hit. The jets started firing first. Lasers. They had better range, over 4 times the range Grunt had with his ion pistol, and Viacons were decent shots. They got a few hits on him as they were coming into his range. Didn't faze Grunt at all, or hurt for that matter. Grunt was a lot stronger than he looked, and Grunt looked strong. He aimed up, slow and steady. At maximum range, Grunt took his first shot. Hit! Didn't seem to do anything to the chaos-loving Viacon. Grunt took a few more shots as the jets closed. He aimed up and shot. Another hit. No noticeable damage. His ion pistol didn't do a great deal of damage. If he could get his hands on them, then Grunt could rip them apart. But in a gunfight, well, he wasn't as good in a gunfight. The jets screamed past him overhead. They hit him again. More shots this time, point-blank range. They couldn't miss, and they didn't. Grunt took harder hits from his sensei when he was learning Cyberate. He turned and took a snapshot. He missed. Grunt let out a few curses on an open AM frequency. The Decepticons laughed over the same channel. 3 beams of purple light burst through the sky from the far side of a hill in the distance. All 3 jets went down. Grunt blinked. What in the name of the light bearer was that? Grunt's AM radio burst to light. Good job, Protoform. Good job, Protoform. Grunt shook his head.
Grinder? Is that you?
Grunt heard the laugh over the comms.
Sure is. Forger said you could use a hand.
Grunt just stood there taking it all in.
Why didn't you tell me? Just got here. Unicron's blood, I wasn't even in a good position. They would have gotten the drop on me if you hadn't cussed them out on comms. Wait. What?
You did a good job, Grunt, Grinder said with mirth in his voice. I'll make sure these cons are fully offline. You get that scrap back to HQ. Grunt put his ion pistol back into payload. He was still confused.
Wait. What?
Then he heard 2 shots of Grinder's fusion cannon in quick succession.
Cons are down. I'll get their sparks for Doc. Primus knows he'll want them. I'm confused.
Grinder sighed over comms.
Just get your scrap back to base, okay, Grunt?
Grunt walked to the front of the girder, lifting it up, then walking to the center of it and laying it back on his shoulder.
Okay.
Grunt sighed. He was burning daylight. This is the first of the Cybertronian adventures that I actually wrote, Chapter 4, because Grunt is a fun character. He's the second character I actually developed for this story, and the first was Doc. And he's totally min-maxed, and I would totally play him in an RPG. All shortcomings and everything. I love playing characters with shortcomings. And Grunt is just so much fun. Lovable, indestructible, and strong as all get out. But fairly useless. Min-maxed as he is, he's fairly useless most of the time, unless you need him to do something that involves picking stuff up or putting them down or getting into a fist fight. Or climbing. He's pretty good at some things, but he's bad at most things. And, well, actually, he's excellent at some things, as you're going to see as the rest of the story unfolds. But he's pretty bad at everything else. Very lovable character. Really helped me get into the mindset of who Grunt is, who these Cybertronians were. The whole idea that they're that they're from the island of misfit toys, as we heard in the last chapter. All right. Talk to y'all later. Keep on trucking, you blam blam truckers.